Hi, my name is Joey Pickering, and today we're going to be talking about genetic diseases and why they exist. So, something interesting I thought about this chapter was that it opened up with a discussion that was supposedly taking place in a college lecture like we are now. And students were posing to the professor, why do these genetic diseases persist? Considering natural selection, why is it natural selection worked against these diseases and weeded them out from us? And that's a good question that had me thinking for a minute. Like why can some of these terrible, terrible genetic diseases still exist, even though people with these diseases are often incapable of reproducing or living by themselves? Specifically in the book, it talks about myopia, which is something as simple as nearsightedness. And why does that exist today? Like our ancestors back then, if somebody couldn't see, they probably wouldn't live that long. They wouldn't be able to survive for themselves, or they might not see a predator approaching them, or they might not be of use for the entire village. Like, so why would something like that continue to arise? So this chapter kind of dives into why these diseases are still around and how natural selection, we all think of it as, the complete imposer of why diseases are around, but it has its restrictions as well. So the first thing I want to talk about before we even get into um, why these diseases are around is just our DNA. Everybody knows we have four nucleotides that fall in order, and that makes up our genetic sequence. But something that I found out that was interesting was that um, only 5% of our entire DNA sequence even contains genes. And of those genes, only 7% differ to where that makes one person unique from me. And knowing how rare it is for somebody to have the same exact DNA as you, that makes it really crazy of like, wow, there's so many possible genes in our body. So with that being said, I next want to focus on how these genetic sequences have been important for us in modern day life. So one of the things that I thought was interesting in the book was um, the book talked about how pregnant women have been going to genetic screenings for a while now since we've known about the technology. And what these screenings have done has made women aware of, what possibilities lie ahead for their child. And most of the time, to come up, maybe they say, hey, your child's going to have myopia, like we talked about earlier, or, you know, something like that. Hey, maybe they might be colorblind, stuff like that. It's not too concerning. People can still live with those in modern times, but they also find other crippling diseases that could impact the child's life immediately, and the child may not survive much past pregnancy. And these screenings have been very important in letting parents know earlier and what they need to prepare for, and also they could also save a mother's life if they know one of these diseases might complicate her pregnancy. So the first thing I talked about was how natural selection, can't always work on these diseases. And one of the reasons is some of these diseases are so rare that it really doesn't have the opportunity to, right? So, like these diseases, some of them come around so few often, and a lot of these times they're covered up by one dominant allele, and the disease needs to be two recessive alleles, and they can just keep on persisting because there's no disadvantage to a person who's heterozygous and is completely normal. So that's going to lead me into this next segment was major functions of alleles in these diseases. So obviously most of these genetic diseases, or a lot of them, can be fatal, and most of the fatal ones are recessive mutations where you need both copies of a recessive allele. An interesting thing that they point out in the book is why incestual or closely related people, when they get married, why their children have such a higher percentage of having one of these diseases. It's because their genetic makeup is close to yours, and if you happen to be a carrier, the likelihood of them being a carrier compared to somebody that's not related to you is much, much higher, and then thus the likelihood of that child being affected is much, much higher, which makes sense. And that's how sometimes, you hear of people like the Kentucky Blue people, for example, in this state, where these people were so isolated that they reproduced with themselves. And then these rare genetic mutations arose and changed the pigmentation of their skin themselves. So something interesting there. And then you can also talk about how, like I said earlier, heterozygous diseases, or should I say, heterozygous advantages, can play a major role in why these diseases go undetected from natural selection. So the major one I want to talk about is sickle cell anemia. So I'm sure everybody's heard of it and knows why it's around, right? Uh, so this particular mutation, if you're heterozygous, you're not affected by sickle cell anemia. Your blood cells are still normal, but you still have a stronger protection against a deadly disease called malaria, which affects the region of West Africa heavily, and which is where this mutation of sickle cell anemia persists. So what happens is so many of these people now have an advantage for being heterozygous. Well, there's a much strongly more likelihood that 1 in 4 of their children, right, will be born with homozygous alleles for sickle cell anemia, and that's when the issues come around. And while these homozygote children cannot reproduce, the heterozygotes can. That's why it keeps kind of bringing up this disease with their downfall. It's an advantage to a certain extent, but then you combine it with another heterozygote individual and it becomes a strong disadvantage. The next thing I want to talk about is that natural selection, like I said, it has barriers itself. Natural selection really only works on one's ability to reproduce. So if there is a genetic disease that can go undetected for a long time and doesn't affect your ability to reproduce, it's going to get passed on whether or not it has bad effects on you in the future. And one key example they pointed out in this book was Huntington's disease, which is a neurological disease. It's terrible. Many affected by it. But this disease doesn't really arise until you're in your 40s. So as we know, most of the time, people in their 40s aren't having kids at that point, but most of the time they have several, maybe some even in college or and late in high school. These kids are older most of the time, and they have this disease as well. And it's just completely undetected because natural selection is not going to work on it because there's no disadvantage to that person's reproductive ability, right? Another one, which I'm actually impacted by this, but my brother has manic depressive disorder. And in the book, they talk about how, in the past, probably in a bad time for equal rights between people, but people that had this manic depressive disorder, when they're manic, they have a higher sexual drive. And maybe that led to them reproducing more often than other males or females or whatever it may be. And then this disease being able to get passed on because it has an actual advantage for reproduction. It gives that individual an advantage in reproducing. So diseases like that, where it's completely genetic, can get passed on from generation to generation just simply because it helps them reproduce, even though it's a detriment to them normally. Another interesting thing they talked about in the book was outlaw genes, which I've never heard of, but there's specific genes that affect our sperm and eggs that will affect how and how quickly they will be able to fertilize. So specifically, like there are some gene diseases in sperm which help them fertilize the egg quicker than all the other sperm, and it only helps that cell individually, but in the long term, the individual is affected. And something they talked about in the book was procyclic ovaries in women. And it's a major cause of infertility and why people have to go to infertility clinics. But these eggs are, or the ovaries and the eggs are actually selected for an advantage when they're in their infancy. And it doesn't think about the individual as a whole and their reproductive abilities past that. So just to wrap this all up, genetic diseases are normally terrible, but it's also something that makes us different, right? The color vision, somebody can be colorblind, somebody can be not colorblind, nearsightedness, farsightedness, stuff like that. There's so many little genetic mutations / diseases that makes us all individual, right? Most of them are harmless. Most of our genetic mutations we don't even know about, because most, like I said, only 5% of our entire DNA sequence is actually coded for genes. So a lot of these mutations don't even occur, right? And the actual sequence that's going to become proteins. So most of these mutations, I should say, are not detrimental to our lives. But those that have been can continue to get passed on through these bypasses, that these little niches, I should say, that they have found to bypass natural selection, right? Some could have no ability on an individual's reproduction until their 40s, like Huntington's disease, or, in certain climates like Western Africa where malaria is present, the heterozygous individual that's not affected is more protected from malaria, but then there's like more likely chance that their child could be born with sickle cell anemia when they breed with another person that's also heterozygous, right? So things like these are ways where some of these terrible genetic diseases can persist in the face of natural selection.